Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 4, the end of section 1. As we're wrapping up this week's content, this section's content, I want to address that this content will not be on quiz number 1, although it is very important for the grand scheme of this course. A lot of the terms covered in today's lecture are terms that we're going to be using in our term papers, in our discussions throughout this semester. And oftentimes, as we will see, due to the use of certain framing and certain circumstances, these terms have been heavily, some would say, politicized or misunderstood in the grand scheme of contemporary politics. So what we're doing today is making sure that every individual in this class, for the means of debates, discussions, and for the means of our understanding our term papers in as clearly as possible, let's provide some uniform definitions and some foundational understandings of the origins of some of the classical renditions of a lot of the ideologies and philosophies that we engage with in today's politics. So let's get going. Let's begin. Today's learning objectives: get a lot of the foundational definitions down for some frequently used terms and frequently used ideologies and philosophies in the United States. While doing that, we're going to understand how it impacted U.S. governance, primarily the theoretical early foundations of the traditional concepts of these ideologies, and how that later impacted the United States, and really just understanding the origins of these belief systems and how they develop over time. So to begin, I want to address something that is essential when it comes to how we understand these terms in particular: framing. Framing is really just the ability for one to establish the context of a certain ideology, philosophy, or any definition utilized in American governance in a way that either mobilizes or suppresses some preconceived beliefs and prejudices about society. So, we think of framing and we have some of the clearest examples. And I hate to be inflammatory, but it's so easy to represent this sentiment through this example. As we see, one of the most notable issues in contemporary governance is the role of the state regarding women's reproductive rights. And we see that this issue is framed in starkly different avenues. We see the framing from one collective either being pro-choice, while the other collective frames the same issue with opposing sentiments as pro-life. And we see this specific framing is a result, is something that will result in you mobilizing your preconceived beliefs about what it means to be, say, pro-life or pro-choice. We're not going to be going into the details of those specific examples, but they very adequately represent what it means to frame an ideology, philosophy, or general policy position. So we also see another example when you look at more specific cases in U.S. and more recent U.S. history. We see early 2000s policy advocated to tax estates after one passes away. We see the reframing of the estate tax, which is what it was labeled at first, as later the death tax, which resulted in it being highly unfavored among the general population and resulting in a lot of pushbacks in its implementation. So we see framing is significantly impactful when it comes to how we perceive general ideologies, philosophies, and policy positions. So what we're going to do in today's lecture is abolish some of the value of framing that we have formed over the years when it comes to our understanding and interpretations of a lot of these ideologies. We're going to have one unified definition that, from the best of my abilities, unifies and finds the common ground among all respected definitions within the realm of political science at large and political theory to understand these concepts. So framing is the establishing the context of, a question, report, ideology, philosophy, policy in a way that mobilizes or suppresses at times preconceived beliefs or prejudices about society. So it influences the way we perceive certain issues. With considerations of framing in mind, let's start understanding utilitarianism, one of the philosophies, ideologies, political theories at large that really is most heavily shielded from the negative impacts of framing, and it will be one of the most easily represented ideologies, political theories in this week's lecture. So utilitarianism, simply put, is the prioritization of creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, when it comes to how we measure the greatest good for the greatest number of people, you see differences in approaches and understanding how we will do this. We'll see two of the main foundational political theorists that, if we were taking a political theory course we would be exploring in more detail include Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mills. And that's where we see a general distinction between what many would refer to as act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. I'm not expecting you to remember these things, but to verbally address it, act utilitarianism is to apply utilitarian practices. It is best to apply an attempt to understand a quantitative value for any action, for any single act. So think of it as you're at a stoplight. To determine if you should go when the light turns green, you would apply a utilitarian application of value. And this, in more specifics, is referred to as understood through Bentham's hedonistic calculus. So you would ask 7 questions, and the answer to these questions would give you a quantitative value for how you should act in that scenario, and you should be able to then apply utilitarianism by doing what is going to create the most good for the most people. Now, in the inverse, you see applications of rule utilitarianism. This is where individuals believe we can create general rules and principles that, when applied, generally provide the greatest good for the greatest number. So it protects us from constant engagement and constant theoretical thought about what we should do next, and instead provides a shortcut to understanding how to apply utilitarian practices. So when we look at utilitarianism at large, we see Jeremy Bentham presenting that general sentiment about the hedonistic calculus, making it to where we can make actions almost mathematical, determining a value to any single act and a value to every individual in which it will impact. So we can quantitate, put a numerical value to any action. While John Stuart Mill has a bit of a contrasting perspective. As he writes a little later on in history, we see John Stuart Mill argues that some pleasures are simply greater than others, and applying the hedonistic calculus does not adequately account for the differences in quality of pleasures. And he uses the example of a happy clam who lives forever on the bottom of the ocean but has no deep desires and benefits and no true value in their life, as they do not provide more benefit to others. But then John Stuart Mill will compare this happy clam that lives peacefully in bliss forever to an angel who lives only 70 years but is able to provide immeasurable amounts of general good to society at large. And he asks the question, which would you rather be, the happy clam forever or the angel that lives on only a limited amount of time? Well, John Stuart Mill would say the majority of people would argue to be the angel with limited lifespan, although a utilitarian practice would, due to how the clam would live forever, would eventually result in the life of the clam being a better application of utilitarian values. So John Stuart Mill identifies this contradiction within the concept of utilitarianism. But when we talk about utilitarianism in this class, we will generally understand it and remember it as the attempt to create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now we see here this picture of the trolley car experiment, which I will very briefly explore today and show you what a utilitarian would do, most hardline utilitarian would do in these circumstances. So we see this picture here, and we see 2 images. The one to the left is of a trolley car and 4 individuals who are tied to these tracks. And then, actually, let me, I don't know why they flipped this, because the thought experiment starts with the picture on the right. Apologies. So let's start with the picture on the right. A trolley is coming up, and on the tracks that the trolley is already determined to go down are 4 people tied to these tracks. But next to you is a lever. You have the ability to pull this lever and make this trolley not run over those 4 people, and instead, sadly, it will divert the trolley and run over 1 individual. Now, how these people got to this scenario, we're not going to bother, and it complicates the thought experiment if you do try to ask those questions. So don't ask those questions, and instead ask yourself, if this was the only information we had, would you pull the lever to save the lives of the 4 at the risk of the life of the 1? Well, a utilitarian, of course, would pull that lever every single day, every single chance they could. 4 people dying is much worse than 1 person dying. 1 person dying when the other option is 4 is the best application of utilitarian principles. But let's change the scenario slightly. It's still 4 to 1, but instead of it being you pulling a lever, you're on a bridge in that image to the left. You're on a bridge over the trolley, and you have the ability, because there is an individual right next to you that is big enough in mass that if you push them over this bridge onto the tracks, the trolley will stop after hitting them, and it will result in the 4 lives being saved. The end result is the same. You would have one individual's death in the name of the four individuals living. But if you apply John Stuart Mill's understanding, you would understand that this act would require you to break your own moral principles of physically harming an individual, as you would physically have to push the individual over. And John Stuart Mill's and those who apply those general understandings of utilitarianism would say that that due to higher and lower pleasures, pushing the individual is not generally valuable and is not the best application of true utilitarian principles under certain circumstances. So we see a divide in the literature between Bentham and John Stuart Mills about the value and higher and lower pleasures of certain pleasures and certain actions benefiting individuals on certain levels. So we see one foundation, of course, to the concept of utilitarianism is the principle of utility, in that all actions should bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number. Almost goes without being said, as it is foundational to the definition of utilitarianism. So just a quick exploration into the trolley car experiment and some understandings of an objective way of viewing utilitarianism in practice. So we can't talk about these topics unless, especially in the state of Montana, unless we explore libertarianism. We're all secret libertarians at heart in this state. We want to have our backcountry to ourselves and the government interference to a minimum. Of course, that's not a hardline application to every individual in this course, I know, but I think we all share at least loose sentiments. So what does it even mean to be libertarian? A libertarian emphasizes individual liberties and believes that when it comes to the state's intervention in our individual liberties, it should be restricted. The state should have minimal intervention in our economic lives and our private lives. So we need to see that libertarianism is the dismissal of the state engaging in our activities. It's a merger between classical liberalism and general radical anti-statism sentiments that really heavily gained traction during the French Revolution and led by a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. But when we look at this ideology, we see one of the main theorists that never identified as a libertarian but helped lay the foundations and groundwork for the ideology is John Locke, as we see a lot of his concepts, especially the sentiments revolving around tyrannical governments and the responsibility and role of individuals to push back against tyrannical governments at the time. And when we look at libertarianism largely at its foundations, it really is just a focus on individuals, individual rights, and individual liberties, ensuring that each individual has the autonomy to be themselves. Then we will see libertarian applications in practice. We also see a sentiment on spontaneous order, and that is the means to achieving rule of law. When we look at a general state that does not apply libertarian values, we would see constant engagement in how society should be structured, constant emphasis on what moral virtues we should encourage and what we should discourage. Well, a libertarian would say the best order in society is the order that happens spontaneously, that happens naturally without interference. It's like saying we shouldn't engage in the market because we're creating unequal tendencies. We're creating benefits that will not be there when the state steps away. So a libertarian would agree with that and argue that that also entails our social life. Authority and order can best be met when it occurs naturally. We see this sentiment sometimes represented in general foreign policy advocations as when it comes to applications of democracy in foreign nations. Many argue that if you try to implement democracy from an external actor into an internal state, it is often met with conflict, while if you allow this to happen naturally, internally from spontaneous order, some would argue, it is more long lasting. So when we see libertarian in the most simple way, we oftentimes hear of it as limited government and free market, and it's not far from what we will think of it as, but we want to make sure that our unified definition of this term is an emphasis on individual liberties that is best met by having minimal state intervention in both social and economic lives. And this is where we get to the ideologies and philosophies that are most frequently framed, and that will be liberalism in addition to conservatism. So when we look at liberalism, let's make sure we all have a unified definition. This is not a term that represents aligning with the Democratic Party. Instead, liberalism means that you are an individual that emphasizes individual rights, civil liberties, equality, a lot of this so far aligning with libertarianism, but with a focus on social justice, limited government external to social justice mechanisms, and the primary role of the state being to protect liberties and promote conditions for human flourishing. we're going to see that primary role of the state sentiment being where we see the biggest divide between liberalism and conservatism. But we see they both have foundations stemming from traditional classical understandings of liberalism stemming from John Locke. We see some of the economic sentiments by Adam Smith and the general structures of government and sentiments regarding the role of society within works like Montesquieu and later Jefferson. So liberalism, we do want to have a federal government that will engage far more than a libertarian would encourage, but engages in a sense to promote conditions of human flourishing. So we want to see a state that intervenes in social justice matters. Liberalism argues that, you know, state actions like what we saw during the civil rights movement are ideal, and we need to have mechanisms in place that will protect minority rights and accommodations and ensure that they are being accommodated for. So we see this generally understood through the encouragement. We see the general encouragement for government intervention stemming from works that focus on the social contract. Liberal ideologies, especially classic liberalism, argues that government stems from one foundational belief, that in society before there was any government, we had desires to protect ourselves. And in order to protect ourselves, we entered the social contract with others. That is an exchange of our right to expand our domains, our territories, to do whatever we desire. We will forfeit that right at times under certain circumstances for the protection of other rights. The protection of our property is what we are being ensured when we forfeit our ability and our right in the state of nature to obtain others' property. So liberalism argues that government intervention is a result of this agreement and exchange within the social contract, and we should have government intervention when it results in greater conditions of human flourishing. Now, not directly in contrast, but building upon liberalism, let's look at conservatism. And within conservatism, we see a lot of these same emphases, but with a little pivot when it comes to the role of the state. So we see emphasis on tradition, social stability. Of course, there are a lot of nuances and different dimensions of this that we will explore, especially through the work of Edmund Burke. But we see emphasis on tradition, social stability, still maintaining individual rights and individual protections, but with a sentiment that emphasizes benefits to gradual change and traditional values and institutions. Also, we see, especially in the early 2000s, a prioritization of free market capitalism as a means to ensure individual liberties and a natural balance to society. Think of that as another means of finding spontaneous order, pulling more so from the libertarian sect than the liberalism sect. And we see that when they talk about the role of the state, oftentimes conservative values emphasize that the role of the state is to promote stability and positive moral virtues. So we see this in the works of Edmund Burke, who is referred to as the first conservative when it comes to political theory at large. So when we look at the definition that I provided, we see that the underlying dimensions of the contemporary definition maintain classical origins. All of those dimensions are founded in classical roots, although we see free market capitalism as a more modern contemporary development that pulls from libertarian ideologies. And we look at this belief system at large that views society as an organic whole with duties as well as rights. We as citizens have an obligation to benefit the state and society we live in just as much as we have the right to benefit from its providings. So when we look at conservatism at large, one historical writer comes to mind more than many others. That is Edmund Burke and his emphasis on the value of tradition and gradual change. Edmund Burke has a sentiment that I believe is one of the best representations of governance and our role in society. As Edmund Burke argues that every institution, every structure of government that we have around us is not only the governmental structures that we are lucky enough to be a part of, but they are what we inherited from our previous generations. The benefits and progress that they made, we have inherited via the institutions that guide, regulate, and enable our lives. So we see a lot of these sentiments represented later on by Alexander Hamilton, emphasizing the need for strong institutions and gradual change. A governmental system that is not vulnerable to quick, rapid majority will, but instead focuses on having a unified and gradual approach to change. So conservatism at large focuses on these traditions, maintaining social stability, emphasizing that the best way to do this is through gradual change and the maintenance of traditional values and institutions, and that the role of the state is to promote stability, focusing on security, and we will look at that later on through the lens of a conflict between liberty and security. So who is Edmund Burke, and why did I even mention him in that slide? Well, he is very well known among political theorists as the first conservative. He was an English politician who argued for political parties as a necessity and argued that we need gradual change in society and political parties as a means to ensure that change is gradual instead of revolutionary. So he stands at a time writing where we have the rise of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, but we also see there's a lot of pushback to these policy positions, these new sentiments. Edmund Burke is one of those, pushing back against the new revolutions of the time. He was, of course, we can remember historically, he was a Quaker who spent his youth at a boarding school, had a significant career early on commenting on public affairs, but later acted as a member of the English Parliament for almost 30 years. So he had a long career in politics. So he's a politician, which when you look at political theorists, it may surprise you that not so many of them were acting politicians in their times. And as he wrote this work known as Reflections on the Revolution, he represented a lot of what came to be the foundations of conservatism. In this, we see a general anti-utopian thinking. He saw a rise at the time of people writing about the perfect societies, and he said, stop writing in the clouds and instead engage with reality. Writing must be practical, not imaginary. And if we are driven by imaginary sentiments, then we will be driven into imaginary results and we need to have practical examinations of governance. He, like many of our founding fathers, was not very for the historical understandings of democracy. Remember, think of direct democracy, think of Athenian democracy, and he even cites Athenian democracy as a reason why democratic practices can be destabilizing and result in the demise of numerous states. So we see Edmund Burke with a general emphasis on respecting authority. He thinks hierarchies within society are natural, and if there are inequalities in a society, there are probably natural reasons and origins to those inequalities, and these inequalities are normally traditionally beneficial. A significant issue at the time as we see a lot of popular uprising against concentrations of wealth. So within his work, he defends an established order in the naturalness of existing inequalities, but also focuses on the best way to maintain society is through this gradual change over revolution. Of course, we know revolution was frequently occurring at the time. So when we look at Burke's conservatism, this may not be conservatism in today's world, but it is the foundations that we have built upon ever since. We see that gradual change against utopian thinking, wanting to have real world applications and understandings of governance, prioritizations of practice over theory, focus on prudence as the ideal virtue, as we need to have patience and temperance within the national government, and we even see a general sentiment aligning with the likes of Alexander Hamilton, another representative of these views, although not a political theorist necessarily at the time, against general true democracies, or better framed as direct democracies. So foundations of conservatism, you can thank good old Edmund Burke, a classic English politician. Sorry about those random notifications. And one thing we have to address when it comes to why we have so much conflict in contemporary days regarding the ideologies behind liberalism and conservatism is a dismissal of the reality that all policy advocation is either a prioritization of liberty or security. If you look in our textbook, pages 11 and 12, you see this conflict engaged with. But we see this, well, before we dive into this, I want to create a universal and objective definition for liberty to better understand this discussion and better guide this discussion. Liberty is and is exclusive in this discussion the greatest freedom of the individual that is consistent with the freedom of other individuals within the society. If I were to put that in layman terms to simplify it to the greatest extent I possibly could, liberty is your and my ability to be and do whatever you want to be and do up until your actions impede others' ability to be and do whatever they want to be and do. Sorry, that's a bit wordy, but it's simplified. Liberty is our freedom to be ourselves up until it infringes another neighbor's ability to be themselves. And when we look at governance and we look at our early formations, we see the Bill of Rights as a protection of these liberties. The government cannot infringe your right to freedom of speech, cannot infringe your right to bear arms, cannot bring double jeopardy upon you, cannot make you incriminate yourself. There a long list of liberties that are protected within our Bill of Rights. We see the guarantee of individual liberties within this guiding legal document. So when we talk about liberty and its relationship with security, we see that we are not shy of examples of this conflict being played out. I hope that flowed with the shift. The PowerPoint slides are weird. But let's talk about that conflict between liberty versus security, because when you break down any policy action by the state, it will be a prioritization of one or the other. We see that little visualization there. We the Peepers, the NSA, I mean, that's a great example of the conflict between liberty and security. Remember the events of 9/11 and a tragic event, tragic period in US history. But immediately following these actions, we had policy initiatives that were implemented for the sake of security. Rationally so. We had national security threats happening domestically. So we want to build security. But we have to acknowledge what comes at the sake of increasing security. That comes at the sake of decreasing liberties. As we can see, the Constitution being outweighed by this prioritization of security. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you look at any action, and particularly the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001, which expanded domestic surveilling mechanisms, this restricted individual liberties to communicate how we desire on these platforms. We noticed there was an expanded use of domestic phone surveillance records. So we see that was a restriction of our liberties. Now, did it negatively impact many of us or any of us at the time? I wasn't personally harmed by this restriction of liberty, and there's many scenarios where you're happy to forfeit certain liberties to obtain security. That's the foundation of the social contract. We'll explore that later on. You have to forfeit some rights to obtain the protection of others. I will forfeit my right to have a safe phone call at certain times for the protection of me being able to be on a plane safely. We see these are also policies that ebb and flow throughout history. We rarely ever see over the entire lifetime of the United States a single prioritization that is maintained throughout our history. For example, the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001 in response to the national security threat of 9/11, which significantly strengthened our means of security while loosening our protections of liberty, we see was later backtracked. We see in 2015, the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015 ended the bulk collection of all records under Section 215 of that Patriot Act. And we see this is a shift, re-examining previous legislation to then prioritize liberty, as the security was already ensured among the general population. So when we talk about liberty versus security, all actions result in the restriction and prioritization of one over the other. And it has to be considered that the prioritization over liberty or the prioritization over security is a rational policy position. And when we discuss politics in this course, in these discussions, in our term paper, we want to be able to use these lenses of interpreting policy positions to add legitimacy to opposing actions, as that is one of the most important responsibilities as an individual, as a citizen engaging with governance. It's that you are making sure that you provide your definitions, which would be your prioritization of liberty or security, while trying to access others, which would be their prioritization of liberty or security in any given instance. Now, when we look at contrasting sides of single spectrums, I think it's important that we address two other terms that we've already mentioned in this course, especially when it comes to what our first political party systems were avoidant of, and that would be tyranny and anarchy. As we saw that the Federalists were advocates for strengthening the national government because they were fearful of anarchy. Anarchy, the complete absence of government. Now we see the Democratic Republicans had the opposing fears of government, as they didn't want to be under tyrannical rule. And they were arguing, well, of course, we know tyranny is cruel and oppressive government or rule. They were arguing that any strengthening of the national government would be the dismissal of individual liberties and the implementation of a future authoritarian state. So we see that these two terms stand at opposite sides of a single spectrum. You can either have the complete absence of government and state and anarchy, or you can have absolute tyranny, which is a cruel, oppressive, excessive government rule or authority. Think of 1984. So we see, of course, these are opposite ends of a single spectrum, representing the most absolute versions of these systems. And we see that, of course, when you look at government throughout history, we rarely ever meet these terms in their absolute forms, and we always find somewhere along that single spectrum within any single government action. So it's important to have these concrete definitions, understand them as contrasting systems of society. So when we talk about all these ideologies and philosophies, they all stem from a starting point. And the starting point is the state of nature. This is universal for all political theories. They all trying to explain, why do we have a state? Why does this government exist? And why have any individuals granted an entity authority over their lives? Well, the story begins with the state of nature. The state of nature is loosely understood as a thought experiment, primarily focused on by the likes of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the state of nature, we see this as a society or condition before there was a state or civil society. Think of this as, and this isn't going to be on a quiz, but maybe if it's on the final or if you use this in your term paper, think of it as the caveman days, but never refer to it as the caveman days. But this is society before there was established society, before there was government, before there was concrete on the ground, before any building had been built, when you were alone in the jungle, the Adam and Eve days, where we were responsible for ourselves and nothing else. In this state, the state of absolute nature, where we are one with nature, we are vulnerable to nature, there are two laws. We are all desiring peace. That is why we will, maybe steal others' goods to minimize their ability to take ours in the future. Or we may make contracts, make treaties with others to maybe later create a state. But we all desire peace. We want to protect ourselves, our lives, and our property. John Locke and Rousseau may differ on what they refer to as either lives or property, but that's another discussion for a different course. We also see the second law of nature. We have to forfeit certain rights in order to obtain peace. So we want peace, but in order to obtain peace, we need to forfeit our right in the state of nature to steal our neighbor's goods, to expand our domain and territories. We have to forfeit that right for others to be protected. So we see this general concept within these two laws is understood as the social contract. We have this desire in the state of nature, and the action that we make to achieve that end goal of peace is what's representing of the social contract and brings us into a society which there are states and authority over our lives. And looking at these three theorists that I mentioned who address the state of nature, I just want to very briefly give you a progression from least optimistic or most pessimistic to most optimistic. We start with the pessimistic point in Thomas Hobbes. His notable work is the Leviathan. I would love to go in detail on the imagery of the Leviathan's cover alone, but that's another discussion for another day. But we see in his works a representation of prioritizations of security and general fears of the state of nature. He says generally that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Your lives are going to be short and dangerous and, well, unpleasant. So he believes that any state is better than a state of nature. He also, it's worth acknowledging all of his works were written after the age of 60 during an English Civil War. So, if you were 60 years old during a civil war, you'd probably be pretty fearful of any anarchical state or anything mirroring state of nature. So you could just apply rational psychology to that one detail and see why he has the prioritizations that he has of security over liberty. And we see in his works a lot of preference and defense of monarchical systems over democratic states, as they are better at achieving this uniform security over any focus on individual liberties, which are met enough within a system due to how much we have security protected. So we will always see a connection between Thomas Hobbes and the prioritization of security as he writes about the state of nature. And you can see John Locke writing a little, around the same time as a step towards greater optimism regarding this general issue. He writes about the state of nature as a state of equality, and not necessarily equality of in practice, but equality of opportunity. We all have the equal opportunity to take our neighbor's goods just as much as our neighbor has the opportunity to take ours. We see in this work a representation of the prioritization of liberty when we look at the conflict between liberty and security, as he does not rationalize the existence of any state, but instead prioritizes the existence of good states and of we're simplifying that at this time, states that are good because they achieve the protection of individual liberties and provides universal and natural rights to all men in society. One of In one of his works, we see a very famous quote being, quote, "Man being born as has been proved with a title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the laws of nature, equally with any other man or number of men in the world, hath by nature a power, not only to preserve his property, that is his life, his liberty, and his estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men." Quote, end quote. So we see the famous life, liberty, and property quote stemming from John Locke, which was later the inspiration to the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in our guiding national documents. But we see John Locke's general focus on a social contract theory with a prioritization of liberty over security under certain circumstances, while acknowledging that we will still enter the social contract, we will still create some states and the means of security. But once we've created that state, we must hold the state liable to ensuring that we get our individual liberties protected as well. We see the two treatises of government, which was highly influential to some of our founding fathers, and we will look at some of the details on how we influenced our founding fathers in a few slides as we look at the specific impacts to the US of these classical ideologies. But we see some loose review here. What is the social contract? Well, the social contract, as I've mentioned in previous slides, is an exchange of certain rights for the protection of other rights. It's an exchange of liberties for the protection of securities, loosely speaking. We enter into the social contract as individuals, although we never have signed our agreement to be governed by a state, but we do so by aligning to the state's laws and regulations. Some argue that private property predates the social contract. Like we see that in John Locke, and we enter this social contract not necessarily to protect our lives and have peace, but instead to protect our properties from the interests of others. We see some of the quotes. I mean, we see the two dominating political theorists regarding the social contract being John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing a later work titled The Social Contract, notably claiming monopoly over this sentiment and analysis, although could not be there without some of the foundations laid by John Locke. As John Locke says, quote, "For no government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it," end quote, and a similar representation of this social contract, but with a prioritization of the general will under Rousseau, and simply put, we know the general will as in the majority. What does a true definition of a direct democracy, democratic state desire? Well, that would be the general will. So what are we doing here? Talking about these ideologies and philosophies from English politicians and French theorists when this is an American government course? Well, I just wanted to briefly talk about this while this slide is up, and then let me answer that question in just a slide. So we can see through the briefest analysis of some of our foundational texts the inspirations that came from these theorists, like Jean Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we see, quote, "that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." End quote. Directly quoted from our direct Declaration of Independence, we see the representation of John Locke's sentiments on the people and the responsibility of the people when it comes to a tyrannical government. We may give the state the authority to govern our lives via the social contract, but we also hold the authority of how this state can govern. We must enable our rights to be protected by restricting the national government from being tyrannical in nature. We also see later on, quote, "we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Certain unalienable rights, identifying the life, liberty, and property quote, but with a little pivot. We might not be focusing exclusively on individuals' property protection, but instead the pursuit of having those property protections. An expansion of John Locke's philosophies on the role of the state and natural laws granted to men, natural rights granted to men. So what are the impacts of John Locke's philosophies on the U.S., particularly? Because we've heard this individual many times, whether you're watching Lost and you like that character that, by the way, represents John Locke's philosophies quite perfectly, or you're looking at some of our foundational texts, wondering why we emphasize life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, why we have certain framing that mirrors the sentiments of those echoed by the great philosopher John Locke. Well, we see three main overarching impacts that I like to focus on in this course. We see that without John Locke's philosophies inspiring the founding fathers of the United States, we would not have the prioritization of individual liberties that we have in our Bill of Rights. We can thank John Locke's philosophies on individual liberty for the inspiration of our Bill of Rights, both our right to freedom of speech and right to bear arms, and hold a state accountable when they may become tyrannical, as that is one of the theoretical foundations of what many argue is our Second Amendment. We also see a prioritization that has been represented by many at the time. Think of John Jay in New York and a lot of his advocacy that education must be a primary focus of the state. In any state, any society, we must prioritize education on the basis, founded off of the one concept of tabula rasa, echoed in John Locke's philosophies, that all humans are born with a blank slate, and it is the responsibility of their educators and leaders and parents to craft a good citizen and good person. And then we know in the two treatises of government written by John Locke, he does a deep exploration of the role of religion in a state. And in this work, he identifies three overarching reasons why we cannot have enforced religion on the state level. He argues that one, any emphasis on a single religion cannot be verified. We cannot determine the validity of any single religion on this planet until the day we die. So we can't speak with absolute truth in any given moment when we talk about the issue of religion. Secondly, when you look at individuals and their religious beliefs, one cannot be compelled into belief by force. One can only truly believe if this is what they are internally driven to do so. This is something that cannot be forced or driven at hand. And third, the third reason why religious tolerance will be emphasized in the United States, echoed within the two treatises of government, is that enforcing any single religion will create more disorder than allowing the diversity of thought. And we see that's one that maybe the likes of Machiavelli might heavily disagree with, but we see emphasized in more recent texts by John Locke that inspired our founding fathers to present sentiments of the separation of the church and state. And I like to tie in a political cartoon here and there whenever I can that also helps present my points, especially that point I made in the first PowerPoint slide. Framing is influential when it comes to how we perceive these issues in these terms. When we look at early political theory, especially around the concept of liberty, we see stark conflict between the British interpretation of liberty and the French interpretation of liberty. Religious authority, morality, and consistency among society under the British, or are we talking about individual liberties, atheism, rebellion, and opportunity for all within the French understanding of liberty? Which, of course, this is a political cartoon, so it favors one perspective over the other. I bet you can guess which one once you read the foundations of these applications of liberty. But we see these terms applied are not a given in every single circumstance, in every single environment. And it is instead essential for us to understand the foundations that drive the use of certain terms in any given moment to diminish the value and impact of framing at large. Do not allow your preconceived beliefs or prejudices to be mobilized against you when discussing politics. Instead, use them as an opportunity to better understand the issues addressed in any given instance. And here's one visualization of that general sentiment. Now, to wrap this lecture up, there are three other terms that, well, we often use in very inflammatory means. and may come up throughout this course as we talk about the role of the state in the economy. So let's talk about 3 foundational economic political theories and make sure that we all have one unified understanding of these theories. So I want to start with capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and political theory in which a country's trade and industry, basically the economy of a state, is controlled by private ownership. So we can all own things no matter what they are. It can be owned by an individual, and that private ownership is driven by profit rather than by the state. When we own these items, we want to obtain the most good for us individually out of our ownership of these items. A state may not have that same incentive, may focus more so on the equal access to these points of ownership. So in a capitalist economic system, price is regulated by competition. We see an equilibrium met within this conflict between price and competition, as competitors will lower prices until the point where it is the till they meet an equilibrium of prices that can be paid for by the consumers and prices that can provide good to the owners of goods, owners of production. So we also see capitalism is generally present in all Western democracies as the dominating global economic theory of the time. And we see that we have a system that generally understands that competition and price will regulate the economy. We see these works. We see the most foundational work to capitalist economic theory being Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. Very long work, but it's worth reading. In this work, he talks about concepts like the invisible hand, that there will be an invisible hand over all economic affairs that will regulate the extent of pricing and extent of economic activities by using the mechanisms of price and competition. If we have price and competition in a fair and open capitalist economic system, we will result in the lowest prices being the prices offered, and the worst competitors, those that do not provide adequate goods for adequate pricing, being pushed and expelled from the market at large. Now, we understand that capitalism comes in contrast to other economic theories. We understand in this course that capitalism is in contrast exclusively to communism. What is communism? And then we'll backtrack in a moment to cover what socialism is. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge that communism and socialism, the definitions we utilize in this course, in our discussions, and our term papers, are the definitions provided by the first theorist to use these terms. That would be Karl Marx. So we're rewinding a good bit, depoliticizing this issue by exclusively referring to the foundational definitions provided when first referenced. So communism. What is communism when considering this? Communism is the advocacy for a complete absence of money and private ownership. And I want to emphasize a complete absence of money and private ownership. In this system, we see that Karl Marx argued that this is the end goal of the state and of the working class. And once we have perfect distribution of all resources, then we can abolish private ownership and any role of money, and additionally any role of any centralized state. So a communist system of government in its purest form, it has no system of government, no centralization of power, no centralization of wealth or private ownership, and instead has absolute public control of all lands and property. Karl Marx argues that communism is the end result of a possible global revolution that stems from economic inequalities that would result in a capitalist economic system, as the means of production would concentrate wealth into select hands, and the general classes, what Karl Marx would refer to as the proletariat, would be, left to survive off of the scraps in its simplest form. Now, how does socialism come into this? Well, in Karl Marx's work, he presents a theory of 6 stages of society, where he starts almost with the state of nature times. And in this, he sees a progression. And about, halfway through this progression is where we're at today, according to Karl Marx. So what is this progression? We will start in a state of nature, and we will create barter systems. We'll develop to feudalism. That's a different discussion that we'll wait till another course to address that. And a few steps later, we hit a capitalist society, the society we generally live in today. Price and competition regulate all economic affairs. But in this economic system, Karl Marx argues in the 6 stages of society, we will have such extensive economic inequalities that this will incentivize the majority of the population, which would be the proletariat class, the workers who do not have adequate funding, to then lead a revolution. And Karl Marx actually argues that this would not be internally within one single state. This will be a global revolution of the workers of the globe. If you ever read the Communist Manifesto, you see global workers unite, calls for those general calls to action. Now, these concepts we see advocated for in a later work, Das Kapital, which came in 3 sections. That is, again, if you thought Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations was long, oh my, wait till you get to the 2nd and 3rd section of Das Kapital. But in that work, we see the presentation of communism and socialism for the first time. And what is socialism within this work? Well, considering that those 6 stages of society, I mentioned that we'll be in capitalism around stage 3 or 4, and that economic system will create such inequalities that there will be a global revolution of workers. Well, the state that the global revolution, the workers on the revolution of workers would provide, they would try and implement socialism. What? Why? How would they do this? Well, the global workers would revolt against the inequalities economically, control the means of production, and then once they obtain control of wealth and the means of production, they will, to the best of their abilities, redistribute as equally as possible. This is according to Karl Marx's 6 stages of society in that general political theory, which first presented socialism. And that's, again, the starting point that we would like to all use universally. So socialism was the required step towards communism. The end goal of socialism is to abolish the role of the state in money and private ownership. But the actions of a socialist economic system is to concentrate wealth, because in order to redistribute things perfectly, you have to have it in your hands at some point. So we see in socialist economic system a high concentration of wealth into oftentimes single leaders' hands, and then this is where a lot of the real world applications get a bit murky, some would say. And then they are tasked with redistributing. And once they have redistributed those goods, all goods and resources perfectly, and then they will abolish their authority altogether. And that's when they would become a communist state. So socialism and communism are two periods in a progression of economic evolution according to Karl Marx's work. And then they have been utilized frequently in the many, many decades since, as Karl Marx wrote these works in the late 1800s. So we have these foundations, and we are using these 3 terms, relying on the capitalist under Adam Smith's definition of capitalism. We're looking, and while looking at Karl Marx's definitions of socialism and communism. So here's some what do we learn slides. This is not going to be on quiz 1, but I think these are some important questions to be able to answer yourself, especially when it comes to just being a citizen in the United States at large. This will strengthen your ability to represent your own interests, as I believe it strengthened mine over time, and this continuous effort to engage in these concepts continuously helps me strengthen my own role as a voting citizen. Here's some of those answers. Remember, we're trying to have universal concrete definitions, primarily for when we use these terms in discussion posts and in our term paper, if we end up doing so, although it is in no means required, and I do not want to incentivize anybody to, but more or less provide a foundation that if anybody chooses to reference these concepts and political theories, ideologies, and philosophies, that they use them adequately in an accessible and tangible way. So what is due this week? Remember, complete that quiz. It covers the first few lectures of the semester. The best resource to study is the What Do We Learn slides. And remember, once you have completed the quiz, it'll be about a week until you can see your score and the correct answers. But use that as a study guide in the future, as we will have a cumulative final at the end of the semester that does relate to each quiz. We have an assignment due next week in which you will be summarizing one of your week's readings, only one of your week's readings. There's a lot of guidance on that when it comes to the assignment tab in Eagle Online. So make sure you read that carefully and interpret what you must. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way possible. Here are some of the readings for the week. A lot of Pew Research Center data presenting ideology and participation, the connection between the two, current just general ideological affiliations when surveyed among the general population, and then another different data set, Gallup, two highly respected data sets, by the way, the most heavily referenced and cited data sets when it comes to social science information. So Pew Research Center and Gallup. If there's one takeaway from this week's readings, it's that you can access these public opinion surveys and get high quality data points that can help you understand certain issues and present your sentiments on those issues at the same time. Thank you, guys. Here's to a good week. You can do this. Quiz should be a breeze, and if you have any questions, reach out. I got you back, and we got this. Thank you.